Well, hello, everybody. If people could come in and find a seat, then we'll get started. I want to start by welcoming you all to People's Church for our presentation today. I wanted to say that this event is near and dear to my heart. Once upon a time, when I was much younger, I lived on an Indian reservation, and since then I've held the Native American culture very near and dear to my heart. And so it's very exciting for me to have Dr. Braun come and share the information with you all, because I feel it's spreading the information about this wonderful population of people and their culture. As far as People's Church and their involvement with the Native American population, this is kind of continuing something that started in the 70s. I don't know, it looks like most of you would maybe remember the AIM trials that happened in Cedar Rapids. And at the time, People's Church provided comfort and safety to members of the American Indian movement. And we offered them funding. We offered them office space. They hung out at our church when it was downtown. We provided shelter for them at Morton's Farm and Seminole Valley that was negotiated by our church member, Roy Watkins. And then we also organized federal marshal watchers. That's a tongue twister. So anyway, so now we move forward to 2023, and we're back trying to more engage with Native peoples. For housekeeping, not that any of you will need this, but sometimes people need to use a restroom. And we only have one on this floor, but if you go straight out that door and kitty corner, it's around the corner. If you need additional spaces for a bathroom, it's more of a trek. You have to go, if you go straight down there, there's a hall, there's a stairway, you go down the stairway, and then you're gonna go back a ways, and then to your right. So you have to find a way. Best would be to grab somebody who maybe has a name tag on, or somebody who goes to church here, and we can take you down there, okay? Then, it is my utmost pleasure to, well, first of all, I need to do a land acknowledgement, since we are here on Native land. We gather within the traditional homelands of the Bakoji, Meskwaki, and Sauk nations. Weakened by war, disease, dependency on trade goods, and debts they couldn't pay, these nations were pressured into ceding these lands to the United States of America and forcibly removed to reservations in Kansas and Nebraska. Some Meskwaki were able to return to Tama County in 1857, where they began the process of buying back their homeland and rebuilding their nation. We seek to honor them and their love of this land. Okay. Now, it is my extreme pleasure to welcome Dr. Braun, and I left. I had it. Oh, I know what I did. It was on the back side. Okay. Sebastian Braun, I've learned. His name is spelled B-R-A-U-N. An aside, this gentleman was born in Switzerland and has come here and learned about this population. So anyway, Sebastian Braun is Director of American Indian Studies at Iowa State University. He was born and grew up in Switzerland, where he also earned a graduate degree in anthropology and history. He then earned a PhD in anthropology at Indiana University and worked for over 10 years in the Department of American Indian Studies at the University of North Dakota. His interests are focused around the intersection of ecology, economics, culture, and politics, and he has worked with, in, and around Native communities on the Northern Plains. Upon coming to ISU, he found that there was no course on Native peoples in Iowa. He has now taught that course for 6 years and feels more comfortable to address some of the historical, cultural, and legal issues involved. I give you Dr. Sebastian Braun.
I'm going to try and use this mic because I like to walk around. I don't like to hide behind podiums. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe give you a presentation for about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit more, just the basics, the absolute basics. And then I would like to invite you to ask questions, because my experience is that most people in Iowa, unfortunately, don't know too much about Native peoples in Iowa or anywhere else. And that's not unusual, okay? So it's like not abnormal. I've made that experience all over the country. I'm going to give you just the basics of the history, and then you can ask me whatever you want, okay? And I don't take offense at any questions, and I'll try to do my best to answer them best as I can. Okay. Okay. I wanted to start maybe with a slide. It's always difficult. So I have a bunch of pictures. Okay. Maybe start with a slide that is peaceful. These are burial mounds, and they are in the F.G. Mounds National Monument, a little bit further northeast of here on the border to Wisconsin. And I think it's interesting, there's an old cemetery a little bit northwest of Ames that is a cemetery for settlers, has been used since the early beginnings of American settlement of Iowa. But the interesting part of it is that it is built into mounds. So the same place that is now a cemetery for American communities used to be a cemetery for Native peoples that lived there. And I think, you can interpret that in many different ways, but maybe one way to interpret it is that both peoples understood that that one place had power, had peace, had something that drew people there to bury their dead ones there in that place, to find a place. And I think what that shows is that, we can share things, we share at least a basic understanding of we want to live in this land, we hopefully are good stewards of this land, we are, drawn to our homes, and now we can go through the history and see how all this worked out in terms of some people taking this home and driving others away from their homes. But we have to keep in mind that whatever the historical realities were and are, that, we could get along and we can get along if we want to. Okay, so maybe start with that. Okay. Maybe the next one. Okay, so Native peoples have been in Iowa for a long time, right? And that might be obvious if you actually think about it, but most people don't think about that. So we have archaeological evidence from at least 12,000, maybe 13,000 years ago, that Native people lived all over Iowa. So even when the central part of Iowa was still glaciated, we have evidence that very soon after those glaciers actually melted, Native peoples came here, lived here, worked the land, and did all the things that people do when they live in a place, right? And that, again, that might be obvious, but it's important to keep in mind that, because when I talk with my students, oftentimes they are like, well, yeah, how long have people been in Iowa? Well, really what they know is that people have been in Iowa, right, for 200 years. But these 200 years are like a very, very little amount of time compared to how long native peoples have been here, obviously. Right? So, okay. Next slide. I'm going to run through this. Okay. Native peoples in Iowa did not live in teepees, did not ride horses, and did not hunt buffaloes. Okay, but they might have hunted buffaloes at some point. But those people that lived here archaeologically lived in houses. They built houses, either like the one that you see up there on the left, where you have wooden posts that give the outline of the lodge, and then probably kind of a roof like that. We don't know how the roof actually looked like because all we find is the post holes. Or earth lodges, like you see in that picture. That's a reconstruction, but we do know that native peoples built earth lodges, especially in the Lost Hills over in the western part of Iowa. They built them into the hills. They had lived, some of them lived in settlements that were organized, that were spatially organized, that had palisades around them, that were organized within other settlements in that region, that had trade networks, and so on and so on. Okay, so it is a common misunderstanding that all native peoples were nomadic, that all native peoples just wandered over the land and hunted things on the land. This is not true in Iowa for at least 5,000 years. Okay. So for at least 5,000 years, people lived in settled villages, in settled towns. Okay. We also know, of course, that while they lived here, they also made other connections to the land. That is, they, for example, built mounds where they buried their dead. They built mounds, sort of effigy mounds, where they had ceremonies. They had these connections to the land that went very, very deep, right? And you don't build those kinds of mounds, you don't build those kinds of earthworks, sometimes geometrical earthworks, if you constantly move around. You build those if you live in a place and you stay there, and that is your home, right? So we know all those things. Okay. And I say we know, of course, this is obvious for native peoples, but I'm talking about non-native people who often, that is not obvious to them because they have learned in school that yes, maybe there were once a few native people here, but they all left for some reason, and then we don't talk about them anymore, and then they're not here anymore. Next slide. Those native people that lived here in Iowa also had agriculture. Okay. And so obviously if you have fields, again, that is not, you don't wander around. And this actually, Eastern North America is one of the very few places in the world where agriculture was independently invented. That is, this is not a place where other people came and said, hey, we came up with the idea of domesticating plants. Maybe you can do that too. No. In East North America, there was an independent invention of domestication of plants. Okay? Very few places. For example, Europe, there isn't. Europe learned how to domesticate plants from the Middle East. Right? The plants that native peoples domesticated are plants like these. So squash, for example, has been domesticated and planted in Iowa for at least 5,000 years. Okay. Sunflowers is one of those plants that was domesticated and planted in Iowa for almost as long. Okay. Then you have other plants that were planted here, domesticated, and used as crop plants. Things like little barley, maygrass, but then also things like sumpweed, which, today, if we see it, we rip it out because it's in the way, it's a weed, right? But native peoples, in terms of when they domesticated those plants, they were able to grow those seeds by 1,000%, okay, from the wild version of the plants. And once you do that, you can use those plants, and native people did this. They used those plants as crop plants, as primary, their primary foods. Okay? So when we imagine how native people lived in Iowa 2,000, 3,000 years ago, we can imagine villages, right? Organized villages with houses, lodges, and fields around them. So agriculture is not something that was brought here. It was here and has been here for a long, long time. Right? And I just emphasize that because a lot of people say, oh, yeah, but this is an agricultural state. Well, since when? Well, since we've been here, right? No, it's been an agricultural state for a long, long time ago. Right? Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm jumping over tons of stuff here. What most people are interested in is the historical part of this history, right? And if I say historical, it's because historians obviously make this distinction between prehistory and history, and real history is supposedly only when people write something down, right? But, okay. So as we get closer to that point when people actually write stuff down, okay, it is very difficult to tie individual groups, that is what today are often called tribes or nations, really, to the archaeological past, because people moved around, and when we find archaeological findings, we cannot tell what language people spoke. We cannot tell what religion they practiced. We find those things that survived, for hundreds or thousands of years in the soil, which is mostly stones and maybe some holes or some fireplaces. What we do know is that around 1000 AD, okay, so about 1,000 years ago or so, there were larger cultural complexes forming in Eastern North America that spread all over Eastern North America. And these societies, there were many different societies. These societies built cities. And I mean, not just towns, not just villages, not settlements, but cities. Thousands of people living in one place. They built large platform mounds with plazas around them, where they probably had ceremonies or ceremonial ball games or political gatherings, or we don't know. And those societies were mostly located south of the Great Lakes. Okay? But around the Great Lakes, we see societies forming that are connected to those others. Okay? And they take on a lot of the same ideas. And those societies archaeologically are called Oneota. And Oneota societies are probably the parent societies, if you want, of the Ho-Chunk, of the Iowa, of the Omaha, and of some other societies, tribes, nations that are still around Iowa today. They are also the societies that came into contact with the first Europeans. Okay. So, have the next slide. The first Europeans who came here were the French. The French came through the Great Lakes, and because they wanted to trade, fur trade. And if you look at Iowa, or what today is Iowa, so on this map from 1684, you can see here's the Missouri River that goes up, and they didn't know where it went. Okay, kind of like it went away. Okay, so this is the Missouri, and then you can see those rivers going up there, and on one of those rivers that goes up, there is a town kind of like where the A is from the law there, right to the right of it. These villages are indicated, and it says Moingona. Okay. And that river was called the River of the Moingona, and of course that is now the Des Moines River. Okay. So Des Moines, it's not French. Okay. The day in Des Moines is French, but Des Moines is actually the name of, or the French name of a native nation that lived on that river. Okay. Just like the Iowa River, okay, is named after the Iowa tribe that lived on that river. And that's why the state of Iowa is named Iowa, because of the river, and the river is named because of the tribe. So, okay. But you can see 1684, this is kind of the extent of what the French knew. Of course, up there, lake, where it says Lac des Illinois, Lake of the Illinois, up there at that time lived the Meskwaki, and the French were absolutely not friends of the Meskwaki. They were friends with most other peoples, but not with the Meskwaki, and started a genocidal war against them a little bit later. Okay. Next slide. This, you can see how by 1718, so just a little bit later, right, how much Europeans already knew about this area and how much they knew about the people who lived here. And in return, of course, how much the people who lived here knew about Europeans. Right? So this is not a case that, you know, all of a sudden these Europeans show up and native people have no idea who they are. There's a long history involved of getting to know each other. And once the Americans show up and actually try to settle this land, like with settlers, their native people knew exactly what the Americans wanted and who they were. Right? You can see here the Missouri is this large river here, the Mississippi is there, so Iowa is kind of like in the middle there, right? And there is this yellow line that goes across from the Mississippi to the Missouri and goes pretty much to where today is the Big Sioux River, and at the end of it, there's several villages, and one of them says Iowa. Okay, and that, of course, is the Iowa. And next to it is another village that's Maha, there's the Omaha, and where those villages are is actually an archaeological site that is called Blood Run. And Blood Run, we know, is a Noneota settlement. So we do know that kind of like these so-called prehistoric settlements flow directly into the historic tribes that came out of them. Right? All of these towns, all of these villages were agricultural, were settled, were, villages, towns. Right? Okay. And over there on the right, it says Les Renards, which is French for the foxes, which is the name that the French gave to the Meskwaki. Right? So at that time, they were still up there, and you can see how large it is written, which means that they were very important for the French, unfortunately in a not very amicable way, right? But they're very important on this map, right? Okay. Next slide. Okay. I'll jump over a ton of stuff here. Okay. Just you can ask me if you want, but okay. Okay. These are the treaties. Okay. And these are the treaties in Iowa. Every square inch of Iowa falls under a treaty. And you can see the first treaty in Iowa, or in what is today Iowa. 1824 down here, just this little addendum down there in Iowa. Right? Then you have 1832, and the last one is a treaty with the Dakota in northern Iowa, especially in Minnesota, but it goes over into northern Iowa, 1851. So within 20 years, right? This means within 20 years, all these treaties were signed, right? And these treaties were all treaties of removal. Okay? That is, all of these treaties that were signed included the removal, which was the official policy of the United States at the time, of native peoples from their land to places further west or further away. Okay. So basically then, within 20 years, right, at least theoretically, you go from an area of the state that is absolutely under native sovereignty, right, to an area of the state that now exists where there are no native people supposed to live anymore. Right? And if you imagine that 20 years, it is very, very fast, right? If you imagine that Lewis and Clark, who are the first, not the first Europeans, but the first bringers of the American state to this area, go up the Missouri River in 1804, right? You have maybe 50 years between that and, at least theoretically, all native peoples gone from Iowa. So if somebody was born in 1800 here, when they were a child, they lived in an absolutely sovereign, native sovereign area. 50 years later, they lived somewhere else because all of this was now owned by the United States. Okay, next slide. The treaties were made, most of them, okay, not all of them, but most of them were made not by military force, but through economic forces. This was planned out. The strategy of the United States, and you can see it laid out here by Thomas Jefferson in 1803, was to get native peoples into debt with traders, and then to use that debt to let it accumulate. And then when the native peoples, had to settle it, they then, had to sell the land. And you can see that very clearly in the last non-Dakota treaty in Iowa, which is the Treaty of 1842, where the Sac and Fox, or the Meskwaki and the Sauk, were approached in 1841 by the government to sell some of their land and said no. And by 1842, they then approached the government to say, can we sell some of our land, to pay our debts? And the government says, no, we don't want some of your land, but you can sell us all of your lands, right? And they don't want to. We have the negotiations. They don't want to sell all of their land, but the government says you can sell us all or none. And in the end, they really have no choice but to sell all of their lands. Right? So you don't have major, large battles in Iowa. You don't have large military conflicts in Iowa. You don't have a military conquest of Iowa. What you do have is the application of economics that forces people to sell their land to the United States. Okay. Next slide. What happened with the people who sold who sold the lands in these treaties is that they were moved further west into what was called Indian territory. And Indian territory was basically the place where native peoples were supposed to, either live until they could assimilate or live out their existence, but just like removed from settlement. Initially, it was everything across the Missouri River. So, for example, the Iowa, some of the Sac and Fox were removed to a reservation which is now straddling the Kansas-Nebraska border. And then some of the, after the Treaty of 1842, for example, some of the Meskwaki and the Sauk were removed to a reservation in what is today Kansas. And then the government decided that there is too much territory in the Indian Territory and removed many of those tribes again into what is today Oklahoma. So a lot of these nations were removed, not once, but twice, 3 times. The Kickapoo were so fed up with this process that they moved to Mexico eventually. They're like, oh, it's fine. We're just going to go to Mexico, right? And they're still there. Some of them are still there in Mexico today. So, that's basically, and then what followed, of course, was the settlement. That is, what happens is the United States buys the land in treaties and then sells that land to individual settlers, right? And in Iowa, it's a great thing in Iowa that you don't have a title. If you own land in Iowa, you don't have a title. You have this book, right, with all the property records. But the first entry has to be somebody bought the land from the United States, right? Because that's how the United States, and that is the reason, because the United States buys the land in treaties and then sells it to individual settlers. Right? Okay, next slide. Okay. Then something absolutely unexpected happens. Okay. In the 1850s, some of the Meskwaki, like others too, they come back seasonally because this is their land. Some of them stay here. Okay? They don't remove themselves. And when people come back in the summer to visit their homelands, to gather, oftentimes you can actually see the calls for the governor, to bring out the militia and round them up and bring them back to where they're supposed to be. And some of the settlers in Iowa got upset with that. And they said, hey, you know what, these people don't do anything bad. They just want to be here, so let them be here. And so we actually have petitions from people in Iowa who petition the state to let people stay here. Okay. And this gets into a process where some of the Meskwaki from Kansas come back and look for lands to buy and find 3 brothers along the Iowa River who sell them 80 acres. It's in the floodplain, so it's pretty easy to understand why they would want to sell that land, right? But still, and the issue is that they cannot legally buy this land because of the treaty. They're not supposed to be here. And so the state of Iowa buys that land with their money for them and holds it in trust for them. Right? And this is 1856. This is unique at the time, that a state that exists really because Native people have been removed from it, right? Actually then actively, right, turns around and not just allows people to live in the state, but actually makes it possible for them to live in the state, right? And that's the beginning of the Meskwaki settlement. So you have the green track there, that's the beginning, and then the Meskwaki Nation has been able to buy more lands and turn that land into trust and hold it as part of their sovereign territory. Right? Okay, next slide. Okay, today we have 4 tribes that have sovereign lands in Iowa. Okay, so the Meskwaki are the only Iowa tribe, because that's counted like where the agency headquarters is, and they're the only tribe that has the agency headquarters in Iowa. But we also have seen the return of 3 other tribes to Iowa in terms of having lands, having federally recognized sovereign lands in Iowa. The Winnebago and the Omaha from the 1970s into the 1980s, through a series of lawsuits that went to the Supreme Court, were able to get land that they owned on the east side of the Missouri River, get that land re-acknowledged as part of their reservations. Okay. That was, that land had been cut off through the river, meandering and then cutting new channels. And the state of Iowa had assumed, well, it's across the river now, so it's ours. Right? And then some people in Western Iowa all of a sudden found out that, no, it's not. It's still a reservation. Right? And then you have the Ponca tribe that bought lands in Carter Lake, which is this little, so I don't know how familiar you are with Omaha, since you're in Cedar Rapids, but Omaha is on the other side of the river, right? And the Omaha airport is also on the other side of the river. But between Omaha, the town, and the Omaha airport, there's this little area across the Missouri River that is in Iowa, and that's Carter Lake. It's a city, okay? And so the Ponca tribe was able to buy 5 acres in Carter Lake in the 1990s and turned that into trust land. And against, again, a series of lawsuits against the state of Iowa, or from the state of Iowa against the Poncas, but now has that land as part of their sovereign land. So there are these 4 tribes that currently have sovereign lands that is surrounded by the sovereign lands of the state of Iowa, which is a much better way to put it than in Iowa, because it's not in Iowa. Iowa surrounds the land. Right? Okay. That was my 35-minute run through 15,000 years of history. And so
Hear me? Okay. So we're going to now start a question and answer period. If you want to raise your hand, Laura will bring you a mic so you can ask the question. There are people on Zoom, so I'm guessing that Brian will raise his hand if there are questions from the people on Zoom. And so people on Zoom, please type in your questions when you have them. All right? So does anybody have a question?
You mentioned nations, you use the term nations, also tribes and villages. So was there must have been some, form of governance that sort of tied together the villages into a nation? And how did that work? Was it like the federal government and the state government here? And
no, not quite. So I think historically, so today we have native nations, which are also called tribes, and these are federally recognized entities. So for example, there are 3 different reservations where Sauk and Meskwaki live. Each one has their own tribal government. Each one is therefore their own nation in that sense. Okay. Historically speaking, when we talk about native nations, there was of course a political organization that bound people together, but that was, if we talk about politics, we often make a hard line between, politics, economics, kinship, things like that. You cannot imagine that kind of a hard line. So economics, that is trade, for example, was, and that's hard for us to imagine, trade exchange was not primarily economic, although it had economic effects, but it was primarily an exchange between kinship groups. And that exchange between kinship groups also created political ties, so especially through marriage between the different groups. The people who were in charge, who were successful in the exchange and took the lead in terms of gathering materials that could then be exchanged with other people who gathered materials from their groups, took a responsibility for the people in their group and therefore had a leadership position. But this is not a leadership position of power. It's a leadership position of responsibility towards the people, right? And so there then emerges or is a grouping of people that come together to make decisions on resources, on diplomacy, on relations with other people, right? Who belongs and who does not belong necessarily to these groups is often somewhat fluid because you can join these groups or you can leave them in terms of living in a community and taking responsibility within that community, or leaving a community and joining a different community, right? So that is also governed in part by speaking a language, although it doesn't have to be. A lot of people were multilingual at the time because there were, of course, extensive connections between tribes, right? So I show you that map where Iowa and Omaha, right, lived together. There was a lot of exchange between what we might call Iowa towns and Omaha towns. But in reality, there was also a lot of fluidity between the two. The languages are very closely connected. There are, kinship ties, and so on and so on. So the lived reality of living in a nation for us, right, with rigid political structures, with formal elections and so on, is very different from the lived reality of living in those nations, but, right, those nations are still real. They exist. It's just that you orient yourself within them in different ways. Does that make sense? Yeah.
What is the most important, biggest tribe or like nation?
The most important,
No, biggest tribe.
the biggest tribe. So today in the United States, it's the Navajo Nation. And, well, the Navajo Nation has the most land. The Cherokee Nation actually has the most people, okay? I wouldn't say, therefore, that they're the most important ones. Those are just statistics. So, I've worked mostly on the Northern Plains, for example, and I have a good friend who's Oglala Lakota, and he says there are two types of Indians. Sorry about it. That's what he said. There's people who are Oglala, and there's people who want to be Oglala. So, it's kind of like if you were to ask, what is the best nation in Europe or whatever, like people have many different opinions about that. And of course, how you live and where you live is always what you know, and like that's what you're familiar with, right?
Can you explain the concept of Indian nations buying land and putting it in trust? Why did they do it that way?
Okay. So what you have to understand is that most Americans own land by buying land and then getting the title to that land, right? And then you can do with that land whatever you want. Okay. This is okay. Native peoples were not American citizens until 1924, okay, in general. Okay. When the US government, when the federal government in the late 1900s started thinking about assimilating native peoples, which it saw as a necessity. Okay. You probably know about the schools and all of that, right? But one of the most consequential policies that it enacted was about land. The reservations were owned in common, that is, by the tribe as a whole, by the nation as a whole. Okay? And for the American government, that was a hindrance to what it termed civilization. Because civilization, as the federal government saw it, was dependent on competition between individuals. Right? So that if I have a farm, but I own it with my brother, and my brother is a lazy, good for nothing, then I don't carry him along with me. Right? He should be responsible for himself. Right? That was the idea. Okay? And so the federal government went and surveyed the reservations, some of them, okay, whichever ones it wanted, and then allotted or gave pieces of the surveyed lands, and 160 acres and so on, 320 acres, to individuals. Okay. But it was sorry, it's a long story. It was very concerned that native peoples who supposedly were not civilized, who supposedly didn't know how to deal with money, all of that stuff, would simply sell their land that they now owned privately, right? And then spend their money and then have nothing left. And then they would fall on the welfare of the state, and that was to be avoided. Okay? And so it said, you will own this land, but we, the federal government, will hold the title in trust for you. Okay. For 25 years. Okay. In those 25 years, you could become what the US government called competent. And once you became competent, you would get the title. Okay. And once you got the title, you now became a US citizen. Because as long as the US government holds the title in trust for you, right, you don't pay state and county property taxes because the federal government doesn't pay taxes to the states, right? That would be opposite world. And so in 1934, those trust periods were extended indefinitely until Congress decides otherwise. And so today still, basically most of the land that was still in trust in 1934 is still in trust. Okay? And this is the way that a lot of native land is owned. Now, as US citizens, of course, individual native people or tribal governments can incorporate, for example. So individuals and tribes can buy land wherever they want. And they then can petition the Secretary of the Interior to take it into trust for them. Okay. And that has several advantages. It has disadvantages, but it also has advantages. Right? The disadvantage, of course, if you have land in trust, is that you cannot do anything with the land unless you have permission from the entity that holds it in trust for you, that holds the title. So, for example, as an individual native person, you cannot, that owns trust land, it is almost impossible to get a loan with the land as a guarantee for that loan because the bank will say, well, do you have the title? And you have to say, no, the federal government has a title and the bank doesn't want to sue the federal government if you, whatever, right? So it's almost impossible, which explains actually a lot of the economic underdevelopment of native communities. But as a tribal government, right, having land in trust, the advantage is also that pretty much the federal government guarantees that that land will be yours, until Congress decides otherwise, right? And so, and you don't pay state and county property taxes on that land. So there are disadvantages, there are advantages, and so, So not all reservations were allotted. So for example, Meskwaki was never allotted, and so the land is still owned in common and is held in trust in common for the tribe as a whole. Right? There's other reservations like that, like Red Lake in Minnesota, or, like other reservations, Menominee, and so on. So there are, when you talk about native land ownership right? You always have to, there are 4 different ways that you can own land. You can have individual fee land. Fee land is when you pay a fee and you get a title. There's tribal fee lands, there's individual trust lands, and there are tribal trust lands. There's a difference in sovereignty over those lands. So more or less, and this gets really, really complicated, but more or less, trust land is the land that the tribes are sovereign over. Fee lands, it gets a lot murkier. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I have a whole slew of questions here, but I'll start with one I think you just answered.
Okay.
I have a friend who lives in northern Wisconsin
Yep.
on a small lake that's so small it's not even on the map up there.
Yep.
And he is very sympathetic toward the native peoples who've borne the history you've just laid out for us. And on his death, he wants to give that land back to a native tribe that is about 20 miles away now.
Yeah.
And he is having a great deal of trouble arranging to give the land back.
Yeah.
He calls it his stolen land.
Yeah. Okay.
I think the complexity of the trusts and all of that you just, is
Yeah.
probably why it's not easy to do.
Yeah, especially in northern Wisconsin, because in northern Wisconsin, in the 1970s, people all of a sudden discovered that in the treaty that ceded all this land to the United States, the Ojibwe retained, okay, hunting, fishing, and gathering rights on the lands that they had just sold to the United States. So everybody from Chicago and Milwaukee and Madison who bought their own lake cottage up there all of a sudden discovered that members of the Wisconsin Ojibwe tribe could actually hunt in their backyards because that was their treaty right. Right? And so people got really, really upset. That adds a layer of complexity to it, right? But basically, he should contact the tribe.
He's tried that.
Right, and then ask if they want the land, because sometimes, tribes, I mean, there's expenditure for the tribes to have to take care of additional land, especially if it's just like a little piece somewhere, right? And then tribes can acquire any land they want, and then they have to appeal to the Secretary of Interior to take it into trust for them. So that's a different process, right? Very often these days, county governments and state governments oppose this taking into trust of lands for tribes. For one, because it diminishes their tax base, right? But for two, because tribes can build tribal casinos on trust lands. And so the suspicion is always that tribes only want to take lands into trust because they want to build a casino. Okay. So that makes it a lot,
Thank you. I have another one. How much of the history that you've outlined for us here in 35 short minutes is commonly understood by the tribal people? Do they know everything that you've outlined to us?
Well, there are, of course, it's just like everywhere else. There are people who are extremely well-versed, much more than me, in their history.
Yeah.
And, there are people who are not as well-versed in their history. That's, but I would say this, right? If you are a tribal member in the United States, I would venture to guess that you probably know more than if you're not a tribal member, because you are constantly confronted with the consequences of that history. So it is in your interest to know it. Well, if you're not a tribal member, you're not confronted with that history at all times, and so you don't have to know it.
I have one more.
Okay.
We'll give our Zoomers a chance here.
Okay, here's a question from John on Zoom. He says, I frequently travel county dirt roads called County B roads in Jefferson County, Iowa. I have often wondered if European settlers adopted those roads from native peoples. Are you aware of any roads established by native peoples, excuse me, that exist today? I am most interested in Jefferson County, but throughout Iowa as well. Thank you.
Okay, so most, I don't know, sorry, I'm not that familiar with Jefferson County, okay? But most roads in Iowa, most county roads are on the grid, right? And the grid was established as a way to dispose of the land that was bought in treaties from native peoples. It was established by Thomas Jefferson in the Northwest Ordinance around that time. Started in Ohio, was first implemented in Ohio, and then implemented all across the country to the Pacific. There's this old myth, this old story, that, first were the buffalo, and then the native people followed the buffalo, and then the white people came and followed the native people, and then now we have the interstate system that follows the native trails, blah, blah, right? Maybe in some places, where you have roads that follow topographic, outlines, of course, why not? But different places were important for native people than were important for Americans. Americans came and imposed their own cultural topography on top of the landscape and built roads that connected those places. And the places that were important for native peoples often, fell out of the memory of the people who now lived on the land, because those people were now no longer there. And so I would venture to guess that there's not many roads that follow native trails. I'm not saying there's none, but there's probably not that many, even if there's stories around them.
There's been interesting archaeological research putting the dates of people on this continent now down 21 to 23,000 years ago in New Mexico, 19,000 years ago in Pennsylvania at Meadowcroft. What evidence do we have of the earliest occupation of people in Iowa?
In Iowa?
Here, in Iowa. Glacial maximum. Were there people here south of the ice?
Well, okay, so we have probably the earliest proof of people in Iowa around 13,000, 14,000 years ago. Okay. That doesn't mean that there weren't people here before. It just means we haven't found any proof that they were. So in terms of the people, humans coming to the Americas, right? I always wonder about the newspaper articles because they make it sound like something new, but like I learned 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that date was absolutely way too late. So I would say at least 30,000 years ago, humans came to North America. The issue is that, so we know there was a land bridge. We know that the continent of North America and the continent of Asia were not separated at all. There was like a huge land, just like that. It's the same thing, right? And the people, of course, settled in what today is Alaska, because Alaska during the last glaciation period was ice-free, right? But between Alaska, what today is Alaska, and the lower 48, there were huge glaciers. And so the old theory was always that people kind of like walked to Alaska, waited there, right? And then the glaciers drifted apart, and then they walked down into the lower 48s. And we can date that to about 15,000 years. And therefore, people said, 15,000 years, that's the earliest possible way. But here's the thing. We have proof of that, right? Is that at that time, the sea level was about 200 to 300 feet lower. Right? And once people translated that and went along the northwest coast and looked not on the current coast, but at the land that at that time was on the coast, that is land that is now 200, 300 feet underwater, you can actually find campsites, you can find places where people lived. And so we do know people were there, when that was the coast. And so by now, pretty much everybody has come to the conclusion that, yeah, this date had to be revised much further back. So do we know that those people came to Iowa? No, I don't think there's any proof. We haven't found any proof of that yet. But if they were in Oregon 30,000 years ago, and we know they were in Central America and in South America not much later, that is about 25 years ago maybe, nothing stands to reason that they shouldn't have been in Iowa. Apart from, in the center of Iowa, of course, where Ames is, right? There was this huge glacier, so people wouldn't live there, but they could have lived all the way around it. I don't know if they did, but why not? Right?
On the map you showed that the French had made for trading, you said that they got along well with most of the tribes, but not with Meskwaki.
Yeah.
Do you know what the history of that is? Why specifically the Meskwaki tribe they had a bad relationship with?
So the Meskwaki were very powerful. They were a large, well-established nation that pretty much in northern Wisconsin, central Wisconsin. They also did not necessarily always get along with the Illini Confederacy that lived in Illinois. And the French were friends with the Illini. And conflict developed because the Meskwaki were like, we control our own destiny. We don't want, missionaries, French traders necessarily. And the French were not used to native peoples not, not getting along, and so the conflict developed out of that. And then the French decided that they had to get rid of the Meskwaki, and this is one of the earliest documented ideas of genocidal warfare against native nations. The French officers actually said, we have to not just defeat the Meskwaki in war, but we have to get rid of Meskwaki men, women, and children, like totally. And they tried to, there were not that many French here, okay? But they, of course, had native allies, and they tried to attack the Meskwaki. And finally, they brought mortars up into northern Wisconsin that could lob grenades into the Meskwaki towns over the Palisades, and that the Meskwaki couldn't do anything about that. So the Meskwaki moved south. There's in Illinois, in central Illinois, like if you go from here to Chicago, right, you can take the non-toll interstate and you can take the toll interstate, right? In the middle between those two, there's this little forest that was a place of like a week-long siege of the Meskwaki by the French and their allies, and from eventually after about a week or so, some of the Meskwaki could get out of it, but from contemporary accounts of that time, they said between 60 and 80 warriors were able to escape that siege, which that's how people counted populations at the time. And then, of course, you have to add, families, elders, children, and so on. And the Meskwaki then came further west and developed, or already had, a relationship with the Iowa and kind of like, I don't want to offend anybody, were given permission or asked for permission or were granted the right to settle in this area, like eastern Iowa, western Illinois, from the tribes that had already been there, and that's where they established their new homeland.
This is not a question, but several weeks ago, there was a Ken Burns documentary called The American Buffalo. And if you haven't seen that, it was really well done, as all his stuff is. And of course, we've talked a lot about land ownership. And of course, before the white man, the Indian did not believe in land ownership.
Well, did not believe in private land ownership, right? So nations, of course, had their territories, but in most tribes, absolutely most tribes, there was no private land ownership, although, of course, individuals were assigned, for example, for fields, the tribe could assign pieces of that land for individual use, right? But you're right, there was no private land ownership in the sense that private people own a piece of land and can sell it to whoever they want, or like own it outright without having any responsibility to others.
I'm just curious about marriages between tribes, or, was there much circulation that way between, or was it more or less centralized within settlements and tribes?
There was all human groups, throughout history, I would venture, were not isolated from other human groups. And so when you have trade contacts, when you have war, when you have, different kinds of contacts, you get to know one another, and you not necessarily fall, and we have this romantic idea of what marriage actually is, right? And most of you are further along in age than me. But when I ask my grandparents, why did you get married? It wasn't because we fell terribly in love, it was because we could raise a family together, right? And we could work together. And you meet people that you can do that, whether they're from your group or from another group, and you get together and have ceremonies, you get together and have gatherings with other people. You have war against them, and you take people captive, and you then integrate them into your societies. And through all those means, people started to, people married each other, people had families together. I have no statistical evidence for how frequently that happened versus marrying people from their own group. But it did happen even between peoples that were, so-called traditional enemies. So for just give an example, those were real kinship ties, right? That then existed between the tribes. So there's this account of the Lakota and the Crow up in Montana, and they were like traditional enemies, right? So they're getting ready for battle. But before they start fighting, they ride up and down, like across a creek from each other, and they say, "Hey, how's my nephews doing?" Because they married each other too, right? And so this idea of either like absolute enemies or absolute friends or marriage partners, it comes out of our own society, and we have to revise it in many ways. It was much more fluid in many ways in pre-industrial communities, I would say, because it's the same thing in European communities. Like before we have nation states that have, exact borders around and policies about who, state policies about who you can marry and who you can't marry and so on. Right? So it was very frequent, and that's why a lot of people were multilingual, because they learned different languages. Right? I mean, most people know Sacagawea, right? Who was supposedly led Lewis and Clark to the Pacific, right? Well, she was although I can't say that in North Dakota, because in North Dakota she's lots of, like, she was supposedly Shoshone, who was then came to live with the Hidatsa, married a French trader, because he was part of that community, because he had lived there for years, and like, you arranged yourself like people do, and like, yeah.
I'm wondering if you have information about the boarding school issue and how it affected Iowans or the native peoples that were here.
Yeah. So there was one boarding school, one federally funded boarding school in Iowa, and it's the Toledo Training School, which is obviously in Toledo. And it was built in a large part to assimilate the Meskwaki. The Meskwaki were very opposed to that school, right? And the federal government tried to force them, come back to marriage, force them to send their children to school by saying, well, we're going to put mostly young men from the Ho-Chunk into that school. And then those men will be around your community. They will meet with your young women, and the Meskwaki are patrilineal. And so if those Meskwaki women then had children with the Ho-Chunk men, their children could not be Meskwaki. And so that was like the first attempt to entice the Meskwaki to send their children to school. And then the federal government incentivized the, okay, there's different stories about this, and I don't want to tread into where I shouldn't tread, okay, but the Meskwaki leader at the time was invited to Washington, D.C., and was recognized by the federal government as the official leader, and was given a stipend, a yearly stipend, in return for sending his children to school, which some Meskwaki then felt was basically buying his favor. And it's a long story, but in the end, there was a Meskwaki girl that either was at school and ran away or did not want to go to school, and the federal agent put himself in position as her trustee, as her guardian, okay, personally, and forced her to go to school. And there was a lawsuit, and a federal judge decided that under no circumstances could a federal Indian agent, be the trustee, be the guardian of an individual Native person. So they couldn't force her to go to school. And at that point, the attendance from the Meskwaki to that school basically was cut in half. Okay? And the school was then turned into a sanatorium. And there was a school built on the Meskwaki reservation, and that's not a very long story. But the federal government in 1819 decided that it would fund mostly Christian denomination schools that were run by missionaries, in terms of supporting. Right? And there's a long history behind that. So, for example, Dartmouth and Brown and a lot of Ivy League schools actually started out as colleges for Native students. The idea was that you could get students into those schools, Christianize them, and then send them back to their communities where they would then missionize the rest of the community. Right? So from 1818 on, the federal government had an official policy that it would subsidize these schools. And then in 1879, it started to build its own schools for Native peoples. And some of those were these off-reservation boarding schools that were far away, that separated the children from their parents, sometimes for years, right? That indoctrinated them, brainwashed them, that forbid them to speak their language and so on. Those policies then officially changed in the 1930s, up to the 1930s and from the 1930s on, to an emphasis on day schools. There were day schools before, but like, it officially changed. And the policies also officially changed. I say officially because, I mean, I've talked to people who went to school in the 1970s, and when they spoke their language, they were beaten with a belt buckle, and so on, right? So from 1912 on, okay, 1912 is the year when over half of Native children actually attend public schools. Okay? So you have, at the same time, you have these American Indian schools, right, that were built expressively for education of Native children, and you have many Native children attending public schools at the time. We still have the Bureau of Indian Education that runs schools for Native children with a very different curriculum these days, hopefully. So the Meskwaki Nation School, for example, is a BIE school, but it has a contract with the tribe, and the tribe delivers the curriculum, that manages the school.
Are you aware of any non-Indigenous groups working with Indigenous groups today to work on some of the issues that are important to both groups, like maybe environment or agriculture?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are, so there are also, there's plain white American people who care about the environment, who work closely with Native peoples who care about the environment, right? But ever since the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s, where you have the civil rights movement on one hand, right, the African American civil rights movement, you have the Chicana movement mostly for labor rights at the same time, and you have the treaty rights movement from Native peoples at the same time, which gives rise to groups like Black Panthers and the American Indian movement, for example, but also others, right? You have a collaboration between some of those groups because they have partially similar goals. Okay. Partially similar goals. You also have you also have other groups that work together. So today, Native peoples, Native nations, Native organizations, Native NGOs, of course, collaborate with people who have the same agenda items, whatever they are, right? It's economic development, it's protection of the environment, it's like all kinds of issues. We live in a modern world. Everybody lives in a modern world, right? Yeah.
Okay, I have watched a couple people look at their watches. We're planning on going till 3 o'clock with this question and answer, so we have about 12 more minutes. And with that, I know there still are more questions. We are going to have a reception afterwards in the room behind here with coffee and water, and we also have bars and cookies, if that's enticing to anybody. I have listened to a few other presentations that Dr. Braun has done similar to this, and I was thinking there's some things that kind of stuck out to me that seem really general for good general information, and one of those things is, what is the correct term to refer to indigenous people or Native Americans or that? Would you please respond to that?
Sure, okay, well, I mean, so it used to be American Indian, right? And actually, when I came to North Dakota, the department was the Indian Studies department, and because it was North Dakota, you know, nobody questioned that until way into the 21st century, when we got like people from India who said, "Hey, it's nice that you do Indian Studies," right? So we changed it to American Indian Studies because, but of course, you know, I run into a lot of people who say, no, you can't say American Indian is Native American, right? And then there's people who say, no, you can't say Native American, it's indigenous, and so on and so on, right? So there's a lot of people who say, so I know a lot of people who say, it's not indigenous because indigenous is way beyond North American. Indigenous is a global term, right? So if we say indigenous peoples, then yes, Native peoples in North America are also indigenous, but it's not exclusive, right? So between American Indian and Native American, okay, my experience, my personal experience, okay, and is that the communities that I work with, especially on the plains, say American Indian or something like that. I mean, they say I'm Lakota or I'm Crow or, you know, but like if they have to, like, I mean, I know a lot of people who say, I speak Indian, you know, like, that's just, and especially older people, like, you know. And then the further away you get to the East Coast, sorry, people say, no, you have to say Native American. Like, from my perspective, there is no correct term because all of these terms are wrong in many ways. There are many different societies, right, that we put together on the one, whichever one of we're choosing under these terms, that are very different from each other in their culture, in their political organization, their religion, in their languages, in all of those things, right? So it's all an invention, right? It's all an invention. American Indian comes from the fact that, you know, the West Indies, because Columbus insisted that he was in the Indies and actually threatened anybody who said otherwise to have their tongue cut out, you know. He was so convinced that he was in the Indies. And Native American, well, yeah, I mean, if you're born, I don't know. You know, people have said, well, if you're born in America, then aren't you a Native American because you're a native? And, you know, I don't know. I kind of try to, if I have to use a colloquial term that brings it all together, I kind of say native. I said a lot of time Native nations. I don't necessarily say Native American nations, but I think if I say Native nations, that's maybe a better use. Or I still say American Indian people, and then try to interchange them because, like, so. But my take, if somebody tells you no, that is not the correct term, you have to use that term. Okay, they kind of don't understand the complexity of it all, and like.
Thank you. We will also, we'll get to this, but, okay, if you.
I have people who've wanted to know how to refer to me. Am I American Indian? Am I Native American? And I usually say, if you know the tribal affiliation of the person you're talking to, that's the best one to use. But if you're in a group of a lot of from different tribes, I think as long as people know that you're not looking down or being derogatory or anything like that, that most people will accept that. But, you know, it's one of those mixed bags. There's always going to have someone having a definitive, this is the only way you can refer to them as. And so, as long as you're being respectful and it comes through, then they're not going to get all upset with you. And if you are corrected, you say thank you. And then just make sure you call them by what the tribal affiliation that they are.
Thank you. And then, in less than 5 minutes maybe, could you talk about mascots and the labeling of mascots? I know that's loaded, but
Okay.
I've
sure.
heard you do it before, so go for it.
Okay, so so when I was at the University of North Dakota, some of you might know this, North Dakota was the Fighting Sioux. And I came into this and several times was almost fired over this. And, you know, people always, so people in Grand Forks, where the University of North Dakota is located, you know, said in all of these conversations, you know, we are the Sioux. We are the Sioux. And it was very ironic because, of course, even when they talked with Lakota or Dakota people, they said, we are the Sioux. You can't take that name away from us. We are the Sioux. And the people said, no, actually, we are Lakota, Dakota, and you're not. But okay, so the problem with so first of all, in Native communities, I think, especially communities that are far away from the schools that have names like that, most people don't have the time to really care. Okay, it's far away. But in North Dakota, okay, the logo, and the university always pointed it out, was painted by a Native artist. Okay, so they didn't understand at all why people were opposed to it, because the logo was painted by a Native artist, who was Ojibwe, of course. And it wasn't so much that people were opposed to the name itself or the logo or anything like that. What they were opposed to was how the name was used, right? How it was used and how the idea of the identification of the school with the name and therefore the people was used. So North Dakota State is the bison. And every time North Dakota State played the University of North Dakota, there would be depictions of Native people being dominated by bison in very explicit sexual ways, for example, right? There would be, the Sioux hung in effigy. There would be, like all of these extremely ugly ideas of the frontier and like domination and conquest would come up, right? And we had a Thanksgiving parade, and then of course when Native people spoke out about they didn't want to see themselves or in effigy treated that way, people became upset. And so things happened like there was a homecoming parade, and there was like a Native, mother who went to the university, a student, and her little daughter standing by the homecoming parade. And people dressed up as cowboys walked in the homecoming parade, and one of them walked up to the little girl and, like, pretended to shoot her in the head with her, like things like that, right? And so I sat in many meetings with the university administration because I was chair of the department, where Native students were in tears, And it all came to a head in the end, kind of, so in Grand Forks, a lot of things are super, but they're not super, they're super, okay? And so there's a super car wash, and there's a super motel, and there's a super this and that, right? And at the end of the semester, people always had students had this party where they did what the cliche of students attending colleges do, and got wasted. And somebody had the great idea of making T-shirts that had the Indian head logo with a beer bong, and it said "super drunk." Okay, and that actually made Al Jazeera international. And so I think that in many ways, if schools really want, really want, a name, if they really want to honor Native nations, and they would go to those nations and they would say, hey, we really want to honor you, and we want to find a right way to do this. We want to find a way to do this in the right way. We want to be respectful. We want to ask for permission. Tell us what we can do to teach our students about the culture, the history. Tell us how we can make ties with your people and so on. I think that many tribal governments would consider it. But the idea that schools just do it in whatever way they can and just like say, this is how we honor you, when they really have no ties, no idea, and just like insist on it, that is very offensive, right? That is because it's defining Native peoples in the way that the school wants to define them, and they have no way of defining themselves. And when you cannot define yourself, that is a definition of powerless, right? You're powerless. You have power when you can define yourself, who you are, that you're here in present day, that you have a voice, that you have a culture, that you have communities. You want to be able to express that yourself because you live it. And so I think the idea of still simply saying, well, we have the right to define you however we want to define you. In the end, I think that's like the most objectable thing in the whole story.
Yeah. Thank you so much. As I said, there's going to be a reception afterwards, and I'm hoping you'll stick around and maybe can have some conversations. I know he's going to drive back to Ames today. There are a couple of things. One, I don't know if any of you noticed, but there is a camera over here tonight at 10 o'clock on Channel 9, KCRG, that they will do a feature on this. They interviewed Dr. Braun and myself ahead of time, and then she stayed for a long time. And I thought asked some really good questions, and she said she had been surprised for how much she learned in this short time. Then secondly, I want to do a plug for, there's an event at Kirkwood on Tuesday night. Vote first. Please vote on Tuesday. But after you vote, I'm just going to read this. Join the Meskwaki Annual Powwow Association on Tuesday, November 7th from 6 to 9 p.m. at the Hotel at Kirkwood Center for Native American Heritage Night. Celebrate National Native American Heritage Month with education on the history of Indigenous people. There will be a display of dancing, information booths from the Meskwaki settlement, Kirkwood programs and other Iowa universities, and a chance to learn more about the only federally recognized tribe in Iowa, the Sac and Fox tribe of the Mississippi in Iowa. Free admission to Kirkwood people, $5 to the rest of us. All right? So again, thank you so much for coming. I think this was very informative. We really appreciate it.